Good evening, everyone. Before us, we are about to encounter paranormal tales, each one more terrifying than the last. Please, get comfortable and prepare yourselves, for what is about to unfold will challenge even the most skeptical. We are about to cross a lonely road, a desolate path that leads us directly into the unknown and the inexplicable. First stop, the apartment. Greetings from Tampico, Tamaulipas. I wrote this account a few months ago, but I still get chills whenever I think about what I experienced. It's hard not to question what really happened that night. We tend to believe that these scary things are just stories, always far from our reality, something that could never happen in an ordinary neighborhood. But I was wrong. We all were. The supernatural does not choose a date, place, or time. 2 years ago, I moved into the condominium where I currently reside. It is an area consisting exclusively of buildings. Although the condominium is small in size, the population density is high due to the apartments. There are 5 streets and about 5 blocks. The buildings start at number 500 and go up to 920. So despite being compact, it is quite inhabited. The rental rates here are affordable, but due to circumstances beyond our control, we have lived in 3 different apartments. We are currently in one on the 3rd floor. Exactly 1 year ago, we were moving from a 1st-floor apartment to one on the 3rd. The move was done by me, my husband, and a friend of his, and we finished around 2 in the morning. The first day in this new home was exhausting, as we needed to renovate and reorganize everything once again. I decided to put my children to bed early and took advantage of the late hours to tidy up the house. Something I didn't mention earlier is that I have 2 children. My baby was only 1 month old, and my older daughter was 3 years old. The first strange event occurred one of those nights when I decided to keep arranging the house. While my baby slept with my husband and my daughter was in her room, I was washing the dishes. At one point I had to stop because I thought I heard my baby crying as if waking up. He was a newborn and woke up often to breastfeed. I didn't hear anything else after that moment, so I assumed it was my imagination and continued with what I was doing. A few minutes later, the crying started for real. I hurried to rinse my hands to pick him up, but before I could, I heard a peculiar sound. It was a soft shh, like the one mothers or grandmothers make to calm a baby. I immediately thought it was my husband, as he was in the same room as the baby. The curious thing was that the little one stopped crying. I finished the task in the kitchen, thinking everything was under control. When the crying returned, accompanied by the same soothing sound, I decided to quickly finish washing my hands and went to my son's room to pick him up. My husband, who was working 2 jobs at the time and needed rest, was deeply asleep. I tried to move him, but he was so exhausted that neither the baby's crying nor my movements were enough to wake him. I picked up my son, breastfed him, and decided to stop the cleaning for that night. I preferred to lie down and rest. However, this was not the only strange event I experienced. Something very similar also happened with my daughter when she was younger. A few days later, another unsettling incident occurred, this time involving my daughter. That night, I decided to put her to sleep in her room. She was starting to get used to sleeping alone, so we opted to leave the mattress on the floor for safety. My daughter had many stuffed animals, which I had carefully arranged in a corner of the room, lined up from the smallest to the largest. That same night, my husband went to bed early, and I stayed with my daughter until she fell asleep. When my baby started crying, remembering the previous occurrence, I didn't want to leave him waiting and ran to get him. I returned to my daughter's room and sat on the mattress, leaning my back against the wall. While I was feeding my son, I looked at my phone. It was 12:42 a.m. I closed my eyes for a moment, and when I opened them again, I saw that the clock read 1:10 a.m. More than 20 minutes had passed. I looked at my daughter, and she had already fallen asleep. I picked up the phone, ready to lie down with my husband, but I remembered that before dozing off, I was feeding the baby. I didn't see him on the mattress, so I assumed that my husband, seeing me asleep, had taken the baby to the crib. I went to our room and felt an emptiness in my stomach when I realized the baby wasn't there. I ran back to my daughter's room and found him lying among the stuffed animals. I didn't want to think about it any longer. I picked up the baby, took him to the crib, and put my daughter to sleep with us in the bed. I decided to reflect on the event the next day. In the morning, I analyzed the situation. It made no sense for my baby to be among the toys, as there was a distance of about 1.5 meters between us. I sat on the bed and considered the possibilities. If the baby had fallen from my arms, he would have been close to me, not so far away. I examined him carefully, gently pressing his head to see if there were any signs of pain or injury, but there were no marks, bruises, or any indication that he had been hurt. To this day, I cannot find a plausible explanation for what happened. A year has passed since those events, and now I feel it's time to share my experience. It all happened exactly around this time, and the memory still haunts me. The fear that whatever was lurking in the apartment, something that seemed focused on my baby, may return, never leaves me. I am grateful for allowing me to share this story. Second stage, the walled up. The 1985 earthquake that struck Mexico City was a turning point. At that time, my father worked at a small snack bar located on Reforma, near the Revolucion metro station. Many buildings sustained severe damage or even collapsed. The place where my father was employed didn't escape unscathed. The bodega, located on the upper floor, was the most affected. After 2 months of assessments and checks regarding the risk of demolition of the building, it was decided that the damages would be repaired. Since my father had worked there for years, he was one of the first to return, being tasked with overseeing the repair work. He arrived early, and soon the work began. He told us that the workers in charge of the job were 2 masons. When they started the process of tearing down a cracked wall, the sound of the hammers echoed, but suddenly the pounding stopped. One of the masons ran down, visibly frightened, and shouted to my father, "Come up!" Upon reaching the location, my father found part of the wall knocked down, and there, amidst the rubble, were 3 bodies walled up, arranged in a line as though waiting for something. It was impossible to ignore that they were skeletons. They appeared to be men, based on the remnants of their clothing. Without wasting time, my father called the owner of the building, who arrived quickly. Without delay, the owner instructed my father and the masons to leave. 15 days later, he returned to work, as if nothing had happened. When my father went back to the bodega, he noticed that the wall had already been repaired and painted, as if nothing had occurred. Everything was in place, and the work resumed normally. As the day passed, people began to return to their routines, trying to move on with their lives after the earthquake. It was at that point that a friend of my father's showed up, and time passed quickly as they talked about the tremor and the damage it had caused. When my father realized night had already fallen, and he still needed to go up to the bodega to leave some items that would be used the next day. Upon reaching the bodega, he saw a man standing at the entrance. When the stranger noticed that my father had seen him, he hid behind the door. My father thought it might be a thief trying to take advantage of the distraction. Since the bathroom was next to the bodega, he assumed the man could have snuck in while they were talking. He quickly went down and called another friend, the owner of a pharmacy, to accompany him. The 3 of them went up again, and the scene repeated itself. The man was at the door, observed them, and once again hid behind it. They ascended cautiously, and when they checked behind the door, there was no one. It was then that the pharmacy owner, with a shaken voice, exclaimed, "There are 3!" And indeed, 3 men were at the back of the bodega, hidden behind a pile of objects. They hurriedly went back down and called the police. When the officers arrived, they listened to the report. One of the policemen, with a serious expression, asked my father, "Did you by chance find people walled up in the walls?" My father, surprised, thought that the owner of the building had informed the police about what had been found months earlier. But before he could respond, the pharmacy owner intervened and calmly said, "No, we haven't seen anything like that here." After the police left, the pharmacy owner revealed something unsettling. He shared that in other places they had found people inside the walls, but these locations were being sealed, and for now, no one knew exactly what had been discovered. He also mentioned to my father that, at the pharmacy itself, they had made the same discovery: bodies walled up in the wall of the storeroom. It wasn't just men, but also women and even children. However, out of fear of the possible consequences, he chose to remain silent. He then decided what might have seemed like a practical solution at the time. He had the remains of the victims sent off with the trucks that were still collecting rubble from the collapsed buildings. The debris, so to speak, was going to be taken to other places where new buildings and houses would be constructed. My father always said that since then he would hear footsteps and voices coming from the bodega. Sometimes he saw 3 figures standing at the back, near the cabinets. On other occasions, he would hear the sound of someone descending the stairs, or even the noise of coins falling and rolling on the floor. To this day, we don't know exactly what those men were doing there. However, as an old urban legend goes, there is something strange about the fact that for some reason it's not uncommon to find bodies walled up in old buildings. So if they weren't there since the construction of the place where you live, it's quite possible that you're not alone. A warning to all who travel these paths. Greetings and safe travels to all. 3rd stage, red hot. Good evening, driver. It's been a while since I've been traveling along this desolate road, and I feel compelled to share one of the many stories I carry with me. The last tale about haunted houses reminded me of a dreadful memory from my childhood, something specific that has haunted me ever since. I remember that as a child, I used to wake up in the middle of the night. At times I still can't fully understand. I believe it was the early hours of the morning, as everyone else was deeply asleep. I used to cover myself completely with the blankets because fear would consume me, especially due to some terrifying events I had already experienced. On that particular night, I was alone in my bed, as my younger brother had gone to sleep at my cousin's house. I remember that my father hadn't yet arrived home. He had said he would be late. Only my mother and my older brother were in the house, sharing the same room with me. The 2 of us slept in a bunk bed. That night, something woke me up. It was breathing, a harsh sound, as if someone was breathing only through their mouth, rapidly and intermittently. I could feel and hear it very close to me, which filled me with immense fear. I tried to hide even more under the covers, desperate, attempting to call my mother. My voice was shaky, almost inaudible due to the panic. I remembered the words of my grandparents, who had taught us to pray the Lord's Prayer 4 times when fear haunted us. I began to pray, but as I spoke the words, that cursed breathing became more intense, and I felt it getting closer and closer to me. The bed seemed to shift, as if something was adjusting, preparing to come even nearer. The breathing didn't stop, and now it was even closer. I thought to myself, this is too much. It must be some kind of prank. Thinking of my older brother, I decided to pull the blanket off to see what was breathing on me in such a sinister way. What I saw was a gaunt creature with reddish skin, almost like it was on fire, and its eyes were enormous, as if burning. Its hands were long with grotesque fingers and nails, and they were reaching out toward my face. I couldn't hold back the scream of terror that escaped from me, and it woke my mother and brother. My mother rushed to the light and turned it on, asking why I had screamed. Still trembling, I told her what had happened. Soon my grandparents arrived, also awakened by my scream. I explained to them what I had seen, and my grandfather, with his habit of sprinkling holy water, began performing a ritual throughout the house. But I won't lie, driver and passengers, I clearly saw the face of that filthy being and the way it formed a cruel smile. Over time, my father passed away in 2020, but after the prayers, he still stayed a bit with the family. On one of those occasions, we discussed the scares, and my cousin shared his own terrifying story, which had occurred in the same house where he lived with my uncles and grandparents. He told us that he had been frightened in the kitchen when he heard someone knocking on the window that led to the patio during the night. When he turned to see what it was, he described exactly what I had seen. The red being, with the appearance of an old man, its eyes fixed and piercing. And as terrifying as it was, I knew that at some point I too would have to face that creature. I still wonder what that creature was that inhabited our house, especially since we could also hear the sound of boots, those with spurs, knocking 4 times on the wooden door of my grandparents' room. I believe this will remain a mystery. 4th stop, the shadow of the Gaisach. Hello, I'd prefer to remain anonymous. The truth is, I don't even know where to begin with this story. It's something that few people would believe. I come from a small ranch called San Jose. This place is part of the municipality of Beta Grande in Zacatecas. They say it's a village marked by tales of witchcraft, terror, and mystery. And it is here, at my grandfather's house, that my story unfolds. At the ranch, families often own almost an entire block, and it's a tradition to divide the land among the children, as is customary here. This event happened 13 years ago. During the Panuco festivities, it is common to take a walk from the ranch to the neighboring town. I remember that, on that occasion, it was the first time I was going to make this journey. My grandfather's house has a large fenced area, which is tightly closed to ensure no one enters during the night. One of those nights, my mother asked me to get my brother's sandals from the truck, as he had left them there. I left the house and started walking. Soon I felt something strange in the air, an unusual sensation as I followed the path. I grabbed what I was asked to get, but noticed a human silhouette in the distance. However, I couldn't distinguish its face or what it was wearing. It was just a dark shadow. When the figure realized I was there, it made that typical hand gesture, beckoning me to come closer. A terrifying fear gripped me, and in panic, I ran back to the room where my parents were. After some time talking and trying to calm me down, I gathered the courage to check if the shadow was still there, perhaps just a figment of my imagination, created by the darkness of the night. When I reached the edge of the fence, I saw that there was no one, but a strange sensation returned to overwhelm me, a growing fear. Then, in the distance, under an old, large and gloomy Gaisach tree, I saw the same shadow, pointing to the ground as if it wanted me to look for something there. Terror gripped me again, and I ran back to the house. I explained everything to my parents, and surprised, they went out to investigate, thinking maybe it was just a prank. However, what they found was only ashes on the ground. They told the story to my uncles and my grandfather, and everyone was shocked by what had happened. They scolded me for not going immediately, suggesting that the most likely thing was there was treasure to be found. Still frightened, I responded that if that was the case, why didn't they investigate it themselves? After all, who was just a simple boy to deal with something so grand? Besides, who could guarantee that it was really a treasure? It could very well have been the body of the shadowy figure buried right there. My cousins, curious about what had happened, asked me where exactly the shadow had pointed. I showed them the spot, and in the following days, one of them decided to dig. To his shock, he found a small jar filled with charcoal. He continued digging, and what he uncovered was a macabre skeleton, still dressed in the clothes of the person who had died there. Terrified, he ran to my uncles and grandfather, and after hearing the account, they called the police, who started an investigation. During the investigation, it was discovered that the bones dated back to the time of the conquest of Zacatecas, and the cause of death appeared to be a gunshot wound. It is believed that the deceased had been buried near where their remains were found. In my family, so many strange things have happened, but something similar only occurred with two of my other cousins. Only one of them had the courage to investigate when the shadow beckoned him. What he found were 3 silver coins, which are now kept by my grandfather. He believes they may be cursed, and that, over time, it may be necessary to return them to the place where they came from to avoid bringing trouble to the family. My ranch is a place full of macabre stories, from the sound of a horse pulling a ghostly cart, to the Llorona, to a lake where children lost their lives and whose cries can still be heard at night. There are so many inexplicable stories that it's impossible not to feel a constant sense of mystery hanging in the air. In various traditions and beliefs, funerals represent a crucial portal for souls to transition into the afterlife. However, these ceremonies do not always manage to free spirits from their connection to this world. Some souls remain trapped, clinging to unknown reasons, leading to unsettling and often inexplicable events. This is one of those stories. If you have the courage, come with me. Let's begin. Many years ago, I made an irrevocable decision: never to attend another funeral. That decision stemmed from an event that left an indelible scar in my memory. It was during the final farewell to my Aunt Angelica. She was not just any relative, she was my second mother, my confidant, and according to her words, I was her favorite niece. I grew up under her loving care, and her departure left an irreplaceable void. The wake was held at her own house, a wish she had expressed in her lifetime. It was an imposing house, with 2 floors. The ground floor housed the living room and dining room, while upstairs were the bedrooms, hers and her daughter's, my cousin, placed side by side. That night, around 10 o'clock, the atmosphere became heavy. I was exhausted. I'd spent hours attending to visitors, offering coffee and comfort. Despite the fatigue, something in the air prevented me from fully relaxing. It was then that the strange events began. First, the creaking of the stairs echoed in the silence. No one seemed to notice, but I felt a chill run down my spine. I looked up towards the darkness of the second floor, but there was nothing. However, a heavy feeling began to invade the space. I told myself it was just the exhaustion playing tricks on my mind, but soon it would become clear that it was not. Still exhausted, I asked my cousin for permission to rest in her room for a while. The fatigue was overwhelming, and soon the weight of my eyelids won me over. However, before I fell into a deep sleep, a disturbing sound jolted me awake: the crying of a woman. This crying was not normal. It was deep, filled with unbearable pain. I realized it was coming from my aunt's room. I sat up, trying to process what I was hearing. At first, I thought it might be my cousin crying quietly, but something didn't add up. The voice sounded too much like my deceased aunt's. I shook my head, dismissing the absurd thought, and got up to investigate. I walked down the dark hallway, the echo of my footsteps breaking the silence. When I reached the door, I tried to open it, but it was locked. "Cousin?" I called out with a trembling voice. "Are you okay? Please, let me in." Suddenly, the crying stopped. But before I could feel relief, I heard something terrifying, loud banging, as if something heavy was being thrown against the walls or the floor. This noise was followed by even more anguished, heartbreaking screams. Panic seized my mind. "She's hurting herself," I screamed as I pounded on the door, trying to open it with all my strength. The sounds continued, echoing throughout the house like a cry of desperation. Minutes later, my uncle arrived, alarmed. He had heard the banging and tried to break down the door. Soon other relatives arrived, and among them was my cousin, pale and frightened. I froze. How could she be here if I thought she was in the room? My cousin, confused, approached the door and turned the handle. To our surprise, the door opened easily, revealing an empty room. We stood still, dumbfounded. We searched every corner, under the bed, inside the closet, anywhere someone could hide. Nothing. The space was too small to leave any doubt. But though the room was empty, the air felt heavy, as if something invisible was still there, watching us. That event left us completely bewildered. We came to the conclusion that perhaps my aunt had returned to say goodbye to her room, to her memories, to what had once been her most intimate space. However, the atmosphere still felt heavy, as if something else was about to happen. I decided not to try to sleep again. The fear of being alone on the upper floor was overwhelming, so I went downstairs to the wake with everyone else. We gathered around the coffin, praying the rosary. On the surface, everything seemed calm, but that feeling that something or someone invisible was with us lingered, like a whisper in the back of the mind. When we reached the moment of silence and closed our eyes, a disturbing sound broke the stillness, the muffled crying of a woman. I opened my eyes wide and looked around. I wasn't the only one. We all heard it. For a moment we thought someone among us had started crying. But as we looked around, it became clear that it wasn't any of us. The silence grew heavier. No one dared to speak. Then the wailing came again, this time clearer, and we heard it distinctly. The sound was coming from the coffin. A chill ran down my body. Someone whispered in a trembling voice, "Is she alive?" Panic took over. We approached the coffin, and with trembling hands we opened it. As we lifted the lid, we leaned over my aunt's body. "Aunt, speak to us," someone cried, their voice breaking. But she was still there, motionless, her skin cold and stiff, her face pale and expressionless. There was no trace of tears or movement. Nothing. Despite this, we had all heard that lament from inside the casket. It was undeniable, and what disturbed us most was that there was no logical explanation. Fear gripped me. I decided never to attend another wake again. That experience marked me forever. I sincerely hope none of you ever have to experience something like this. The paranormal may seem fascinating from a distance, but when it happens to you, it leaves deep scars. My friend had partially told me that the deceased person was his grandmother, someone I had never had the pleasure of meeting. I didn't want the first time I saw her to be under such circumstances, so I chose to stay out in the living room. The atmosphere in the place was suffocating, almost oppressive. The dim light was barely broken by the flickering candles near the coffin, casting long, dancing shadows. The scattered flowers around barely softened the harshness of the moment. When I sat down, my friend, attempting to ease the mood, offered me coffee and bread. Time passed slowly. Around 2:40 a.m., my friend asked me for a favor, to take the guard position by the coffin. Without hesitation, I agreed. I positioned myself at the foot of the casket, avoiding looking directly at it. With my back turned to the coffin, I stood still, the cold of the early morning biting into my bones. Then, something happened that I would never forget. Around 3 a.m., I saw an elderly woman walk through the door of the room. She didn't walk like the others. She simply appeared. She was an elegant lady, dressed in a sober but distinguished black dress. Her hair was perfectly styled, and despite the sadness she emanated, it was clear she had paid attention to every detail of her appearance. However, something in her demeanor disturbed me deeply. Her eyes were red, not just from crying, but as if they emanated an unfathomable, almost inhuman sorrow. She didn't say anything. She simply walked to the back of the room, sat in one of the chairs, and buried her face in her arms, sobbing. The crying was heart-wrenching, but contained, as if she was struggling not to break down completely. I watched her for about 30 minutes. During that time, the room began to empty. Most people decided to leave, leaving only a handful of us behind. But that woman remained still, crying incessantly. A knot formed in my stomach as I watched her. Her sorrow was so deep it seemed to tear at the air. When my shift was over, my friend took my place as the guard. I slowly withdrew, but I couldn't stop thinking about that elderly woman. Something about her didn't fit. Her presence felt different, too heavy, as if she didn't fully belong to this world. Here is the continuation of the story, recreated and connected with the previous events. I was deeply worried about the woman who was crying silently at the back of the room. There was something in her pain that made me want to approach her. Finally, I gathered the courage and walked up to her. As I stood in front of the elderly woman, I gently asked if she wanted me to bring her anything, coffee, water, anything that could help. She didn't respond. Her sobbing continued, muffled but constant, as if words were not enough to express her grief. I decided to sit beside her, trying to offer some comfort. I placed my hand on her shoulder, hoping to convey support. At that moment she slightly lifted her face and with a trembling voice, broken by suffering, said something that froze me. "It's not my time yet. I know I'm not young, but it's not my time yet. I want to stay here with you." Her words were as perplexing as her tone of infinite sadness. I swallowed hard and clumsily tried to say something comforting. However, my efforts were in vain. The elderly woman simply lowered her head again and continued crying, ignoring my attempts to cheer her up. I decided that it was best to give her space. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, where I took some coffee and bread, hoping time would help calm her. About 20 or 30 minutes later, I returned to the room. To my surprise, the elderly woman was no longer there. Her empty chair felt like an echo of her sorrow. I didn't think much of it. I assumed she had quietly left, like people often do when they want to avoid more pain. However, around 6 a.m., something happened that would change my perception of the night. The family brought in a large framed photograph of the deceased woman. It was a portrait they placed near the coffin, and when I looked at it, my blood ran cold. The woman in the photo was identical to the elderly woman who had been crying in the room. Maybe she had a twin, I thought, trying to find a logical explanation. I couldn't hold back my curiosity and asked my friend about it. His response left me speechless. "No, my grandmother didn't have any twins," he replied, looking at me with a puzzled expression. When I explained what I had seen and described the woman, my friend fell silent for a moment. His face transformed, and with a mix of astonishment and fear, he led me to the coffin. "That's how my grandmother is dressed." I was breathless when I saw the woman inside the casket. Her hair, her dress, her makeup, everything matched the elderly woman I had spoken to moments earlier. It was then that I understood her words. "It's not my time yet." She was referring to herself, and her sorrow wasn't for someone else, but because she wasn't ready to leave. That night changed me forever. How could I ever look at death the same way after that experience? Dear passengers, good evening. This is your conductor speaking. It is a pleasure to have you with me on this journey along a desolate and mysterious road. Today, we will explore a theme that is undoubtedly among our favorites: chilling and paranormal accounts experienced by healthcare professionals. Tonight, we will focus on the experiences of nurses. So please, recline your seats, fasten your seatbelts, and relax, for from now on, you are in good hands. Let us embark on our voyage into the unknown. First stop, the hospital chapel. It all began on a night shift at a large university hospital on All Saints' Day, November 1st. The emergency room was crowded, and I was assigned to the trauma unit. Around 11:30 p.m., a patient arrived with a severe wrist fracture requiring the insertion of pins. I accompanied the patient, the trauma surgeon, and an elderly nurse, already accustomed to the hospital's nocturnal environment. The trauma room was located near the chapel, which had been locked since 8 p.m. During the procedure, as I prepared the patient and the nurse organized the instruments, I distinctly saw a figure pass by the open door. The doctor saw it too and asked the nurse who else was on duty. She calmly replied that only the three of us were there and that she had locked the door. A few minutes later, the lights began flickering and a murmur of prayers echoed through the room. The nurse smiled and remarked that strange phenomena were common there, but she had never heard prayers before. Suddenly, everything stopped, as if nothing had happened. The procedure was completed, but the feeling that something or someone was watching lingered throughout the night. Later, we learned that in the 1940s, a nurse had died in that very corridor while praying for patients during a wartime bombing. Second stop, the warning. I work at a small public hospital in rural Mexico. One night, before starting my shift, I went to the restroom near the unit where I was assigned. While washing my hands, a young woman burst in, desperate, pleading for help for her father, who was in cardiac arrest. I immediately alerted my colleagues, and we managed to stabilize the man just in time. The next day, when talking to the patient, I mentioned his daughter's quick action. He looked at me in surprise and revealed that no family members had accompanied him that night. When I described the young woman, he began to cry, saying she matched the description of his daughter, who had passed away 5 years ago in the same hospital. That moment left me speechless, as it seemed something far beyond normal had occurred. A few days later, I asked the staff if they had seen the young woman that night. Everyone denied it. This led me to search for more details about the case of the deceased daughter, discovering she had tragically died in an accident while trying to save someone else. Her photo was displayed on a mural in the hospital as a tribute, confirming my description. Third stop, the horrors of the psychiatric hospital. In 1995, I began working at a psychiatric hospital in the United States, surrounded by a dense forest. The building, constructed in 1870, had a Gothic architecture and a long history of suffering, especially during the 1930s and 1940s, when lobotomies were performed under precarious conditions. By the time I arrived, only 100 patients remained in the hospital, which was set to close in 2 months. Due to a lack of rooms, I was offered a space on the 5th floor, unused for years. On the first night, I woke up to see a woman in an old nurse's uniform standing by my bed. When I turned on the light, she vanished. In the following days, I explored the abandoned floor and found old photographs, recognizing some staff who still worked there. One night, I heard cries coming from the old nursing station. Following the sound to a locked room, I entered and saw a figure crouched in a dark corner. As I approached, it disappeared, leaving a chill down my spine. During the final week before the hospital's closure, I got stuck in the elevator, and a cadaverous figure appeared behind me. She placed her hand on my shoulder, and I experienced flashes of what seemed to be her murder. I later discovered that a nurse had mysteriously disappeared years earlier amidst rumors of a relationship with a doctor. That hospital closed, but its memories live on in every corner of my mind. Fourth stop, the Forbidden Room. In a hospital in southern Brazil, there is a room that no one dares to use. During my internship, I was assigned to a ward where this infamous room was located. When I asked why it was always empty, a veteran nurse explained that years ago, a patient had taken her own life there. Since then, reports of paranormal activity began to emerge. One night, during a blackout, I went to retrieve candles and flashlights from the storage room next to the Forbidden Room. As I passed the corridor, I heard a low, drawn-out laugh. Looking around, there was no one. As I approached, I felt a cold breeze coming from the slightly open door, which I was sure had been locked. I peeked inside and saw the figure of a woman with long, disheveled hair sitting on the bed, staring directly at me with deep, hollow eyes. I took a step back, and when I blinked, she was gone. I never walked through that corridor alone again. Weeks later, I spoke to the veteran nurse again and discovered that before her death, the patient had reported hearing voices and feeling presences in the room. The story continues to haunt everyone, and the room remains untouched, like a tomb of memories. Fifth stop, the nameless patient. It was a calm night at a hospital in London when a man entered the emergency room unidentified and in critical condition. He was rushed into surgery, but unfortunately did not survive. However, the strangeness began after his death. While completing the paperwork to send the body to the morgue, a nurse remarked that his name did not appear in any records. Later that night, while organizing documents, I heard footsteps in the hallway. When I went to check, I saw the same man standing outside the emergency room looking inside. He seemed calm, but as I approached, he disappeared. The next day, we reviewed the security cameras, and to our astonishment, he had indeed been captured walking down the corridor minutes after his death. Days later, we began noticing some medical equipment in the room where he was treated, malfunctioning inexplicably. Lights flickered, and alarms sounded for no reason. The entire staff began avoiding the area, claiming to feel strange presences. Dear passengers, these have been our stops for the night. Each story carries the weight of inexplicable mysteries that make us question reality. I hope you have enjoyed the journey. If you liked it, don't forget to share it with friends who also love spine-chilling tales. Until our next meeting, when we will explore another stretch of this desolate road into the unknown. It was a hot night in Mexico, the kind of night where the air carried the scent of dust and the stars shone brightly in the dark sky. In a small village known as San Hierro, 4 friends had gone out for a walk. They were bored and looking for something exciting. Between laughter and jokes, the conversation naturally turned to the scary stories of the region. San Hierro was an ancient town, full of traditions and legends passed down through generations. Among them all, there was one that stood out for its ability to send chills down the spines of even the most skeptical. It was the story of the Road of the Lost Voices. According to the older residents, those who dared to walk it after midnight were lured by whispers from the surrounding forest, voices calling travelers to never return. Miguel, the boldest of the group, looked at his friends with a mischievous smile. He was always the one who loved provoking the others. Can you imagine if we went there to debunk that silly story? I bet nothing will happen. Beside him, Rebecca rolled her eyes, visibly impatient. You always want to act like the brave one. These stories exist for a reason, Miguel. But if you want to prove you're fearless, go alone. Come on, Rebecca, Emily said, almost laughing, as she adjusted her backpack on her shoulders. This is just folklore. Every village has these legends, and if they're not real, at least we'll have a good story to tell. Francisco, the quietest and most sensible of the group, looked uncomfortable. Listen, I don't think we should mess with this stuff. My abuela always said that those voices, they're not just imaginary. They're souls that suffered, souls that seek company. Miguel laughed it off, trying to sound casual. Your abuela also said that if we whistled at night, La Lechuza would come for us. That's just superstition, Francisco. Come on, let's prove we're smarter than these ghost stories. Although hesitant, the group eventually gave in to Miguel's suggestion. The idea of exploring the Road of the Lost Voices seemed irresistible. After all, they were young. The fear mixed with adrenaline made their hearts race, and they wanted something to break the monotony of the night. The road was a few kilometers away from the village, surrounded by dense forests and mountains that loomed in the distance like silent watchers. As they got closer, the atmosphere began to change. The air felt heavier, the trees taller and more twisted. Miguel, always leading the way, held a flashlight that cast flickering beams of light on the uneven dirt path. Rebecca felt a pang of regret when they finally saw the start of the road. It was just a dirt path, but there was something sinister about it. The tree branches formed a kind of tunnel, blocking out the moonlight. The place seemed swallowed by a darkness that made no sense. "This is it," Miguel said, with a tone of challenge in his voice. But even then, he hesitated for a moment. An inexplicable chill ran down everyone's spine, even though the night was warm. The group began walking slowly. Each step felt heavier than the last. Rebecca hoped Miguel would give up soon, but he stubbornly pressed on, laughing nervously. Emily stayed close to Francisco, who seemed to sense something strange in the air. As the son of generations of farmers, he felt that there was something wrong with this place. The silence around them was unsettling. There were no sounds of crickets, birds, or any signs of life, just the sound of their own footsteps and breaths. Then, for the first time, they heard it. It was a low sound, almost indistinguishable, like wind passing through tiny cracks. But soon it became clearer, a murmur, voices, words that couldn't be understood, but they were there. They stopped simultaneously, looking at each other with wide eyes. No one said anything, but they all knew they had heard it. Miguel broke the silence with a nervous laugh. "It's just the wind, it's nothing." But his voice trembled. He knew it wasn't just the wind. As they walked deeper in, the murmurs grew louder. Rebecca started feeling a pressure in her head, as if something was trying to enter her mind. Emily clung to Francisco's arm, unable to hide her fear. "It's closer now," she whispered, almost inaudibly. At some point along the road, the voices began calling them by name. First it was Miguel's name, whispered sweetly but with a strange melody, as if it was something ancient, unlike any modern language. Miguel stopped abruptly, swinging the flashlight toward the forest. Nothing, but he could feel something watching him. Francisco, who had heard countless stories from his grandmother about lost souls and deceitful spirits, was the first to suggest they turn back. But the voices wouldn't let them leave. They began to scream desperate. They sounded like they were in pain. But at the same time, there was something cruel in them. Something that said, "You belong to us." Rebecca was the first to give in to panic. She ran without thinking, plunging into the forest's darkness. The others shouted after her, but their calls were quickly swallowed by the murmurs that now filled the air. The sense of despair was suffocating. The whispers were now like muffled screams coming from all directions. Emily and Francisco also became separated in the confusion. They tried to follow the beam of Miguel's flashlight, but something seemed to distort the road. It was as if the ground was shifting, twisting beneath their feet. Emily fell, and when she looked up, there were faces, hundreds of pale faces among the trees, staring, unblinking. They didn't move, but she knew they were alive. "Francisco!" she screamed, but her voice was lost in the murmurs. She tried to stand, but something cold and invisible held her down. Miguel was the last to remain on the road. He moved forward hesitantly, holding the flashlight as if it could protect him. But then he stopped. In the middle of the path stood a figure, tall, hunched, completely shrouded in shadows. The figure had no face, but Miguel felt it was watching him. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, he fell to his knees as the flashlight rolled away, leaving everything in complete darkness. The next morning, the road was empty. The villagers of San Hierro found backpacks and belongings scattered along the path, but there was no sign of the young people. They say that even now, anyone who passes the road of the lost voices can hear the murmurs. They start low, almost imperceptible, but if you listen long enough, you'll realize something terrible. The voices know your name. Welcome to a mysterious journey where I will accompany you along a path filled with secrets and enigmas. I am the guide for this unique experience, and I am grateful for the trust you have placed in me by allowing me to share these moments with you. Here, we cross the boundaries of the known and enter dark territories where the real and the supernatural meet. Our journey today will take us through 3 unsettling tales, each more disconcerting than the last. At each stop, we will witness events that will challenge our understanding and raise questions about what lies beyond our comprehension. But remember, once the bus doors close, there will be no turning back. So, settle in, fasten your seatbelts, and get ready. The journey begins now. First stop, the fire. Good evening, everyone. Let me start with an event that occurred 2 years ago. At that time, tragedy struck a small tortilla shop in Mexico City. It was a modest place, family-owned, where the aroma of fresh tortillas filled the air. However, that night, something unimaginable happened. It was a critical period during the pandemic, and many people stayed connected through neighborhood messaging groups. I was part of one of these local groups in Gustavo A. Madero. Around 2 in the morning, my phone buzzed with alarming news. The tortilla shop was on fire. The usually quiet streets quickly turned into chaos, filled with sirens and hurried people. When I arrived at the scene, I saw firefighters battling the flames, which consumed the building with relentless fury. A gas tank was about to explode, making the setting even more terrifying. Fear was visible on everyone's face until a new message appeared in the group. "A woman is trapped on the upper floor." The words hung in the air, but when the firefighters went upstairs to rescue the supposed victim, they found no one. Then, one of the oldest residents of the neighborhood shared a disturbing photograph. The image clearly showed, amidst the flames, the silhouette of a woman standing on the 2nd floor, observing the scene with a fixed gaze, as if she were in another realm, oblivious to the danger. The photo quickly circulated among the community as proof of the unexplainable. Who was this woman? Was she a spirit, an illusion, or something that transcends our understanding? The fire left deep scars. The tortilla shop was never rebuilt, but conversations about that night still echo among the residents. Many claim to hear footsteps in the empty lot at night. Perhaps the mysterious woman is still there, or maybe she is the echo of something that will never be explained. Second stop, the teacher. Now, I'd like to share a personal experience from when I was still in school. It all happened on an ordinary day that quickly became anything but. As I rushed out of the house, I saw my teacher standing in the middle of the street. He was motionless, as if waiting for something. His posture was strange, but I decided to ignore him. However, something inside me urged me to pay attention. In the following days, the scene repeated itself. The teacher remained in the same spot, looking at me with a strange expression, a mix of rejection and sadness. However, he didn't show up for classes. His colleagues and students talked about his absence, but no one knew the reason. Soon, rumors began to spread. He had passed away suddenly. One day, as I walked past him again, I felt a warm hand on my shoulder. When I turned around, I saw him slowly fade away, as if consumed by a mist. Later at school, we learned that he had actually died months earlier. He was no longer among the living when he began appearing to me. I was intrigued by the thought that perhaps he was trying to send me a message before moving on to the other side. His expression reflected guilt, remorse, as if he were trapped between 2 realities, trying to complete something left unfinished. Third stop, my friend Roberto. Finally, we arrive at the last story of today's journey. This one involves a friend from my teenage years, Roberto. He was a young man whose life was marked by emotional and family challenges. There was something in his presence that conveyed sadness, but also a quiet strength that few noticed. Roberto often spoke about his desire to give up on life. I tried to help him, encouraging him to find reasons to keep going. He had an impressive talent for music and dreamed of one day playing in a great orchestra. Unfortunately, he couldn't withstand the pain and tragically took his own life. The day he died, he came to see me in the afternoon for a goodbye that felt strange but serene. He seemed at peace with himself, talking about a journey, as if he was ready to leave. The next morning I was told about his death, which had occurred the previous afternoon. I had seen him after his passing. How was that possible? There was no rational explanation for what happened. His parents confirmed the time, and in shock, I realized he had sought me out for one last farewell before leaving this world. Today, I understand that moment was his way of ensuring he would be remembered fondly. He needed one last moment of connection before departing, and wherever he is, I hope he has found the peace he so desperately sought. And so, we conclude our journey for today. I deeply thank you for accompanying me on this mysterious path. Remember that each story, no matter how unsettling, holds a lesson about what makes us human, even in moments that go beyond our understanding. As you reflect on these tales, keep in mind that the unexplainable often challenges us to question our own beliefs, and perhaps, just perhaps, the answers lie in places where reason cannot reach. Now rest, close your eyes, but don't lose focus. The road will always have more stories to tell. Until next time. 2 weeks ago, as I was leaving my soccer practice, I saw some posters glued in various places. They said, "Desperate for money? Contact us at this number and forget all your financial problems." I took a photo with my phone and showed it to my mom at home. She warned me, "They probably won't hire you, you're only 17. But after some convincing, we decided to call. A sweet-voiced woman answered. "Are you interested in the job?" she asked. "Yes, I need more details," I replied. She explained, "Do you know Mono's Pizza? It's a pizzeria on the outskirts. Your salary starts at $5,000, increasing by $5,000 each day if you continue. Your shift starts in 3 days, from 5 p.m. to 4 a.m. Skeptical, I agreed, even though it sounded too good to be true. On the first day, I arrived at the address, a large, modern-looking establishment. Sophia, the woman from the call, greeted me warmly but mysteriously already knew my name. She introduced me to Jorge, the manager. He reiterated the unusual pay system and warned, "Follow the rules and you'll be fine." Curious, I checked a computer file labeled "Rules for Surviving Mono's Pizza." Initially, I thought it was a prank, but I read the rules anyway. 1. Turn off all freezers at exactly 6 p.m. or the noise will attract itbe. 2. If a clown-like customer arrives, serve him immediately. 3. Keep a printed copy of these rules. The list might change on the computer. 4. If the freezers turn back on after you've turned them off, hide in the basement for 10 minutes. 5. Sophia will never visit you after her shift. Don't let her in if she appears. 6. If someone calls for pizza after 1 a.m., take the order but never prepare it. 7. Once your shift starts, you cannot leave the pizzeria. As bizarre as it sounded, I took my position behind the counter watching the clock. At 5:30 p.m., Sophia left. My hands shook as I turned off the freezers at exactly 6 p.m. Moments later, I heard faint noises, like whispers, coming from the kitchen. Remembering the rules, I didn't investigate. Around 8 p.m., a man in a clown costume entered. Without speaking, he pointed to the menu. I rushed to prepare his order. He ate silently, paid, and left. By midnight, the environment seemed eerily quiet, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At 1:15 a.m., the phone rang. The voice on the other end simply said, "Large pepperoni." My instincts screamed not to prepare it, so I followed the rule. Minutes later, there was a knock at the door. I froze. Peeking through the window, I saw Sophia, but her face was unnaturally stretched into a grin. I didn't open the door. As dawn approached, I felt a sense of relief. At 4 a.m., Jorge arrived, smiling. "Well done. Here's your first pay," he said, handing me an envelope. Inside was $5,000 in cash. Each night brought new horrors, yet the pay kept increasing. By the fourth night, I was making $20,000, but the tension was unbearable. On my fifth shift, I noticed a new rule in the printed list. Do not answer the phone after 3 a.m., no matter who is calling. On the sixth night, I broke. The whispers, the clown's silent appearances, the calls, and Sophia's distorted grin outside the window became too much. I resigned, leaving behind the promise of unimaginable wealth, but holding on to my sanity. Now, every time I pass by Mono's Pizza, I can't help but wonder what happens to those who stay until the end.